The Land Cruiser is dead. Long live the Land Cruiser in Lexus form. It was recently announced that the iconic Land Cruiser would no longer be coming to the United States. So even though we recently saw the all-new Land Cruiser launched for other markets, in the United States, all we're going to be getting is the LX 570, or whatever it is they're going to call the next generation LX. This is the third generation model that I'm standing right next to, and it's widely anticipated that later this year, or perhaps early next year, we're going to see the all-new fourth generation Land Cruiser. I mean Lexus LX 570. I mean Lexus whatever. This is the third generation model. This is one of the oldest vehicles you can buy in North America in terms of general design. This was originally designed back in 2007. It's had two facelifts, 2011 and 2015, but in an odd sort of way, the LX 570 is still relevant because if you're looking for a rugged luxury off-road body-on-frame vehicle with the go-anywhere dependability and reliability and just go-anywhere design that we've come to expect from the Land Cruiser, this is the only option. There are certainly other luxury off-road vehicles. Land Rover makes a wide variety of them, but the average Range Rover is going to be much more expensive to buy and more expensive to keep around than the LX 570. And if you're looking for something with a frame, you have the choice between this and something really expensive like the Mercedes G-Wagon. Now this model starts north of $96,000 before destination. This is the second most expensive Lexus model in the lineup, but it's still strangely a good deal when you compare this against a full-on Range Rover or something like that G-Wagon. Up front, it definitely looks like a member of the Lexus family. We get the very large Predator grille there. They call that the spindle grille, multi-module LED headlights, and the Lexus swoosh inside. But it is important to keep in mind as we look around this LX 570 that the bulk of this vehicle is getting a little bit old. In a way, the most direct competitor for the LX exists inside the Lexus portfolio, and it's not the Lexus RX. That's a unibody vehicle designed to compete very directly with the Acura MDX, the Acura RDX, etc. I'm talking about the Lexus GX, the other Lexus Land Cruiser in the lineup. This is the Lexus version of the Toyota Land Cruiser, the full-on Land Cruiser, and the GX is the Land Cruiser Prado, the slightly smaller, slightly more nimble Land Cruiser. Both of these vehicles are rugged body-on-frame vehicles. The LX 570 is available as a 2-row or a 3-row vehicle. Oddly enough, so is the Lexus GX. But the dimensions of the LX are a little bit larger. This is 200 inches long, it's 78 inches wide, which is pretty wide. It's also pretty tall at over 75 inches high. One of the reasons that people shop for this over something like a Range Rover is because this does have a solid axle in the rear. That gives this certain advantages off-roading, but it also means that we don't have quite the same kind of ground clearance as we find in some of the competition. This does have an electro-hydraulic adaptive suspension system that can raise the rear 2.4 inches and the front suspension about 2 inches, but that doesn't actually increase the ground clearance at 8.9 inches because the minimum point of ground clearance is the differential in the rear, and that angle does not change. Things are a little bit different in the Range Rover lineup and of course something like the Jeep Grand Cherokee or the Jeep Grand Cherokee L because those have independent rear suspensions, and that means that you can actually push the wheels down and increase the amount of clearance you get over the center of the vehicle. Moving to the rear, the design is pretty restrained. We have full LED tail lamps back here with amber turn signals, and then there's a hitch receiver right there behind that center section. The glass of the LX 570's hatch does not open separately, but we still have a tailgate here. So we have a hatch on top, and then we have a tailgate below, something that we don't find in too many SUVs or crossovers out there. I really love this touch, but you should know that unlike BMWs and some Land Rovers, the bottom part is not powered. According to the rumor mill, the next generation LX will get a turbocharged V6 engine under the hood, but for the moment, this has a 5.7-liter naturally aspirated V8. It produces 383 horsepower and 403 pound-feet of torque. It's mated to an 8-speed automatic transmission, so a few more gears than we find in some of Toyota and Lexus's body-on-frame vehicles. It also has a relatively unique four-wheel drive system, because rather than simply a multi-plate clutch in the middle, this has a true center differential. It's a torsion center differential, which can send torque front and rear when needed. It also has a 2-speed transfer case, so this has a true low-ratio mode. All of that together with the body-on-frame nature and the 6,000-pound curb weight is the reason that fuel economy is a little on the low side at 14 miles per gallon combined. The seating position in the LX is pretty traditional for an SUV. As time has gone on, more and more SUVs are trying to give a more car-like seating position, even though they're pretty high off the ground, and instead here we have more of a truck-like seating position, so fairly upright, fairly high off the ground, and the step-in height is much higher than something like the Range Rover lineup. We have a power tilt telescopic steering column, a memory-linked driver's seat with 3-position memory, power extending thigh cushion, but oddly enough, only a 2-way lumbar support. Unlike the Lexus LS flagship, the passenger seat does not have the same range of motion as the driver's seat, and it doesn't have the memory settings on the door either. Moving back into the second row, we find stadium seating. So the second row seats are a little bit higher than the first row, and the third row is even higher than these in order to accommodate some of the systems under the vehicle. We have a powered second row seat here, so it power slides forward and backward, but the recline mechanism is manual. It has a pretty decent recline, just as you might expect in a vehicle that's available as a 2-row or a 3-row. This generation LX was very loosely based off of Toyota's half-ton truck lineup, and as a result, it is definitely wide. That is one of the things you'll notice about this versus the Lexus GX. This second row bench is just about as wide as the average half-ton truck. You could very easily accommodate 3 adults back here, and I have a generous amount of headroom even here in the middle. I have about 1.5 inches of headroom. Scooting all the way over to the right side of the vehicle, this front seat's all the way back in its tracks. You'll notice I only have about 2 inches of legroom. One of the odd things about the LX 570, just likely due to the design of the vehicle, the big hood up front, etc., is that we don't have nearly as much legroom in here as you'll find in a Range Rover. A Range Rover will have between 5 and 7 inches more legroom. In another blast from the past, the second row seats do not latch into position when they're up like this. So instead we have a little bit of a cinch right there, and then that hooks onto the handle on the door to keep the seat from flopping down on your cargo. There is a mechanism to power flop them forward, and then of course I can press the button and fold one side or the other right up there to the side. That does mean that they take up a little bit more cargo room than the average SUV or crossover out there when they're in the folded position. So you can see I can put some extra luggage right here and still use this one side, but not as easily as some of the competition, and there is no extra underfloor load storage. Combined legroom comes in below the Highlander, and if that front seat is back in its tracks, it does make getting back here into the rear just a little bit tricky, but I can definitely do it. This second row seat is all the way back in its tracks. You'll notice that if the seat is in a more comfortable reclined position, my knees are definitely digging into the back. The LX 570 is unusual in a different way. This third row bench is a 3-person bench, but it is a 50-50 bench. That means that rather unusually, the 8th person in this interior is going to be straddling this crack and the hinges for the third row seat as they sit in the seat, and the headrest is connected only to one side. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that this model does have a bunch of different options available on the LX 570. We have a pretty standard sized moonroof right here over the driver and front passengers' heads. There are height adjustable shoulder belts and height adjustable headrests for the first and second row. The leather upholstery in this model is perforated because the seats are both heated and ventilated, and you can see how thick these seats are. I think that's one of the reasons that legroom figures in the LX 570 fall a little bit below the competition, is just the sheer thickness of these seat backs, both in the first row and in the second row. Obviously with thinner seats you'll get a little bit more legroom, but these have sort of a Barca-lounger or recliner kind of character to them. Not a lot of bolstering going on the seat bottom cushion or the seat back cushion. If we move on over to the front doors, there's a lot of stitched materials going on here, a lot of real wood trim as well, but we still find some hard plastics down at the bottom of the door. Remember, of course, that this is still based off of the Land Cruiser, which is definitely designed to be more of a rugged off-road vehicle. The glove compartment is one of the slot variety. I was not able to fit a large tablet computer inside, but you can see this one has a ton of different accessory stuff from Lexus in there, the wiring harnesses for the trailer connector, etc. The dashboard is a combination of stitched goods lower down here on the dashboard and injection molded plastics up here on the top, and then a large amount of wood spanning from one side to the other. This wood is sort of mocha colored. It's a little bit difficult to show on camera. One of the things that Lexus has not updated with the LX in quite some time is the infotainment system. This does not have a touchscreen LCD like we find in more modern Lexuses, and it does not support Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. It's also one of the few Lexuses left that uses a joystick-like controller in order to control that infotainment system. This is certainly my least favorite input method for a modern system. Below the infotainment system, we find 2 large air vents, an analog clock, engine start-stop button, the controls for the 4-zone automatic climate control system. You control the front 2 zones with these controls here. You can sync them together, and then you control the rear zones via the infotainment system, or of course the controls in the back. Below that, we have 2 USB inputs. Those are close-offable via a little lid, but you can't do that while a smartphone is connected. We then have electric parking brake right there, 2 large cup holders, and then a very traditionally styled shifter. The center console does feel a little bit cluttered, especially because of that infotainment controller right there. We have, again, that gated shifter, sport mode right over there, controls for the heated, ventilated seats, heated steering wheel, and then all of the various off-road controls and 4-wheel drive system controls. We have a crawl control and multi-terrain select that allows you to choose different terrain types for automatic adjustment. We then have a drive mode selector. This adjusts the adaptive damping system in the suspension as well as the engine transmission. We then have 4 high, 4 low over here to lock the center coupling. We then have the adaptive height functionality with the suspension via that little toggle right there. You can turn it off if you want to change a tire, etc. And then we have some additional controls right here in front. Lock the center coupling, start and second gear, stability traction control off, hill descent control, hill ascent control, also on and off. We have a button to turn on and off crawl control mode, and then this button right here is quite interesting. It tries to help the vehicle turn a little bit tighter when the differentials are all locked. Between the front seats, we have a large padded center armrest, which opens to reveal a fairly small storage compartment because this one is actively cooled. You can turn it off with that button right there, and then keep sodas and other things in there cold. Rear seat passengers in this model are treated to an available rear seat entertainment system, well-integrated window shades, the second row seats are heated and ventilated, and we have 4-zone automatic climate control. The instrument cluster features a pretty traditional design, no big LCDs here or anything like that. We have a ton of physical gauges, and then a color multifunction display in the middle. That display gives us fairly basic information like trip computer readouts, but you can see that it does have one off-road screen where it shows the position of the front wheels. The steering wheel is a round 3-spoke design with 3 wood sections, one on either side of the bottom spoke and then one right there on the top. Since this is one of Lexus's older wheel designs, we have the controls for the cruise control system on a stalk right down here, and then the distance is set via this button. We have a lane keeping button, a button for that multifunction display, and then infotainment controls on the left side. There are also paddle shifters on the back. We have up on the right and then down on the left. I'm out on the paved road for 2 important reasons. The first one is this vehicle is a little bit big for my off-road trail. Some pickup trucks have problems, and this is just about as wide as a half-ton truck. The second reason is that there was a windstorm around here, and so some of the brush has fallen over and encroached upon the trail, and I really don't want to scratch a $100,000 Lexus. I'm sure they wouldn't really appreciate that. So instead, let's talk about on-road driving dynamics because, to be perfectly honest, most LX 570s are going to find themselves on the road 99.99% of the time. In my 0 to 60 testing, this model went 0 to 60 in 7.2 seconds. It has a nice V8 growl to it, but the interior is definitely well hushed. The astute among you will notice that 0 to 60 time is slower than a wide variety of the competition. I think the main reason for that is simply the way the transmission's gear ratios have been selected and the final drive ratio. This doesn't really have that off-the-line push that you'll find in some of the competition with more aggressive gearing. Also remember, the LX is pretty heavy, over 6,000 pounds in the top-end configurations. So there's a lot of weight to move around, a lot more weight than you'll find in something like a Range Rover. And you'll really notice that if you come to a complete stop, and then you just romp on the throttle. You don't get that instant kind of acceleration you find in most of the German competition, or of course the British competition, but you do have a lovely, naturally aspirated V8 engine growl. Thanks to the wide tires in this model and relatively hefty brakes, I went from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 120 feet. That surprised me. I had expected this to take a little bit longer to stop from 60. Because you'll definitely notice that the LX 570 is sort of tuned on the marshmallow side of things when it comes to the suspension tuning. Even if I put this in Sport Plus, which is the firmest suspension mode, I can feel some of the smaller imperfections coming through, but there's still a reasonable amount of body roll, still a reasonable amount of lean, and the weight of the LX 570 is ever present. This is not the kind of big SUV that's demanding to be hustled around a winding mountain road, although it can definitely do it if you push it a little bit harder. Handling is not intrinsically poor, it's just that the vehicle feels big, it feels soft, it feels heavy. Some people may like that. This is definitely going to be my choice if I was going to go on a longer highway journey. This is the ultimate highway cruising SUV, especially if I put this in the comfort mode. Things are very, very comfortable, but it's not going to feel as sharp, as engaging as a BMW X5, or even, I would argue, the brand new next generation Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon. On the other hand, this is significantly less expensive than a G-Wagon. The LX 570 is an incredibly comfortable vehicle. It has a really supple suspension tune, even though this does have relatively low profile tires for an off-road vehicle. And that's all due to the electro-hydraulic suspension system. This gives us adaptive height and adaptive damping. The feel of this adaptive suspension system is definitely different than a lot of the air suspensions that you'll find in competitive vehicles, whether we're talking about something like a Jeep Grand Cherokee L on the low end of the cost range or a Range Rover on the high end. When you have this in its high height mode, it doesn't have that sort of right up against the bump stops feel that you'll find in a lot of air suspensions out there. And that's because the way the suspension operates is a little bit different. And the rear suspension is not a fully independent suspension. It's still a solid axle. Now, at its highest height, it still gets a little bit firmer. I'm in that mode right here. And again, remember that in the high height mode, it doesn't actually improve ground clearance. Instead, it's going to improve approach, departure, and breakover angles because the vehicle is higher off the ground, the body of the vehicle is higher off the ground, but the minimum point of ground clearance is still going to be the differential on that rear axle. In my cabin noise test, I measured 69 decibels at 50 miles an hour, easily making this one of the quietest vehicles that I've ever tested. And you'll really notice the difference between this and a unibody SUV or crossover like a Range Rover or Grand Cherokee or Durango, etc., when you have a trailer connected to the back, because the body and the frame are isolated from one another. So if you do plan on towing 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 pounds, this is going to be a lot more isolated, a lot quieter inside than some of those other alternatives. But you'll also find relatively similar isolation for a little bit less money in the Infiniti QX80. Over a week of mixed driving, I've been averaging 12 miles per gallon. That is definitely below the EPA estimate for this vehicle. Remember that the LX weighs over 6,000 pounds, and I do go up and over a 2,200-foot mountain pass every day. It's also important to remember that this 5.7-liter V8 does not have all of Lexus's latest fuel-saving technologies. This is significantly less efficient than the newer 5-liter overhead cam engine that they have in some of their sports cars. This is a bit more of a truck-designed engine. It's designed for longevity, reliability, and likely also a little bit of reduced maintenance costs over time. The downside to that is fuel economy, which is certainly low. This does not have cylinder deactivation, this does not run on the Atkinson cycle, it doesn't have any of those modern fuel-saving technologies, and the 8-speed automatic transmission doesn't necessarily appear to be well tuned for fuel economy with this particular engine either. Also keep in mind that this is a full-time 4-wheel drive system. And this system lacks some of, I guess you'd say, the tricks that we find in other modern 4-wheel drive systems to help improve fuel economy. There's no front axle disconnect feature where it can disconnect the right and the left side of the front axle for improved economy. In fact, it can never completely disconnect the front axle at all. The front axle is always going to be sent some power. On the other hand, the LX is going to feel very confident in slippery situations like snow, sleet, ice, etc., because all 4 wheels are always getting some power. Now, on the other hand, this does not have a locking rear differential and it does not have a locking front differential, features that you will find in some of the competition. So if this is really on a rougher trail, like say you really want to take this rock climbing or real off-roading, you're going to notice that the brake-based system is not going to be as capable of sending power around as a true locking differential. And that is going to be important because this is quite heavy off-road. Categorizing the LX 570 is a little bit tricky. In North America, we are not going to be getting the next generation Land Cruiser, but we will be getting the LX 570. Some people are disappointed in that, but honestly, I think it makes a lot of sense because personally, if I were going to buy a $90,000 to $100,000 luxury SUV from Toyota, I would want the Lexus badge and the Lexus interior. The interior of the LX 570 certainly feels more premium, more luxury than we find in the Land Cruiser, even though the two vehicles are surprisingly close in terms of sticker price. The other reason it makes a lot of sense is because Toyota has a decent number of body-on-frame SUVs in the US. They have the 4Runner, the Sequoia, the Lexus GX, the Lexus LX, and formerly the Land Cruiser, so losing the Land Cruiser is really not going to hurt the bottom line too much. Some shoppers will just go for the Sequoia if they want the Toyota logo on their rugged body-on-frame SUV with 3 rows, or they'll just move over to the Lexus brand and pay about the same amount but get nicer interior components. Categorizing the LX 570 is tricky because there are some luxury body-on-frame SUVs, but none of them quite have the off-road dependability and capability that theoretically you could get in the LX 570 if you were willing to start swapping a few parts from the world market Land Cruisers into the Lexus. Because the important thing to know about the Lexus in the US is that it doesn't receive all of the off-road goodies that are available on the Land Cruiser model. It's also a body-on-frame SUV, so structurally it's quite different than a unibody vehicle like a Land Rover Range Rover or a Jeep Grand Cherokee L, even though you can get 3-row versions of those. But because the LX offers a blend of off-roading and luxury, let's dive into some of these almost competitors. Obviously, the Range Rover and Range Rover Sport have to be on this list. The full-on Range Rover starts at $92,000, but it's not a 3-row vehicle. It will become a lot more expensive than the Lexus LX 570 if you get carried away with options. That's because Land Rover's Range Rover has always been sort of the off-road companion to a Bentley or a Rolls-Royce in some wealthy circles. So if you're the kind of person that had a Bentley Coupe or a Rolls-Royce sedan and you wanted something to go visit your country estate on the weekends, you probably had a Range Rover. And realizing that they're losing sales to the very expensive SUVs that we find from Rolls-Royce and from Bentley, Land Rover has been chasing those models with the top-end trims of the Range Rover. The Range Rover Sport starts at $69,500. It's a 5+2 seating arrangement, so really not far off what we see the LX 570. Depending on exactly what kind of off-roading you want to do, either of these options could be more off-road capable than the LX 570, but they're certainly going to be a great deal less reliable. Definitely keep that in mind. Also, kind of a possible comparison would be the new Jeep Grand Cherokee L. This is a 3-row vehicle. On the outside, it is bigger than the LX 570, but not by a huge amount. The Grand Cherokee L is a little bit narrower. It doesn't feel quite as wide as the LX 570, but depending on the version that you get and the features you get, it can feel a hair more premium, surprisingly enough, because the very top-end versions of the Jeep Grand Cherokee L will have complete leather interiors, leather dash, leather doors, etc. The mid-level trims have just upper leather, and the lower parts are hard plastic, so they aren't going to feel quite as premium. On the other hand, the Grand Cherokee L will top out significantly less than the LX, at about $71,000. The Grand Cherokee L has all of the latest Jeep off-road systems. It is incredibly capable. It has an airlift suspension with more ground clearance than we find in the LX 570, but keep in mind it's not going to be as reliable, and it is a new product, so definitely keep that one in mind. There's also going to be the Jeep Wagoneer later. That's going to start at $68,000, and the Grand Wagoneer is going to go up to over $100,000. Those vehicles are pretty big, though, compared to the LX 570. And that size is also something that you should keep in mind if you're comparing the LX 570 against a Cadillac Escalade or a Lincoln Navigator. Even the short wheelbase versions of the Cadillac and the Lincoln are going to be notably bigger than the LX 570. They're also not overtly off-roady, and even Jeep is saying the Wagoneer is simply going to be too big to wear the trail-rated badge. The Grand Cherokee L is going to be the biggest thing in their lineup that they're going to call trail-rated, which is their term for more rugged off-roading. Next, I suppose you could say the German competition would be the BMW X7 and the Mercedes-Benz GLS, but they're very different vehicles as well. They're certainly more on-road focused, more luxury focused, and more performance focused than we find in the LX 570. So acceleration, handling, braking scores, etc., just the feel of the vehicle is going to feel more premium, on-road focused, more performance focused than we find in the LX 570. The LX is really tuned to be a comfortable off-road vehicle that has reasonable driving dynamics on the road and then floats along like a cloud. In many ways, the most direct competitor for the LX is the Infiniti QX80. The QX80 is based on the Nissan Patrol. The LX 570, of course, is based on the Land Cruiser, and the Patrol and Land Cruiser have been very direct competitors in other world markets. But in the United States, we've never actually had the Patrol exactly the same way that it's found outside the United States. We have the Nissan Armada, which is a close relation. It looks very, very much like the Infiniti QX80 on the inside. It's actually nearly identical on the inside. But outside the US, the Nissan Patrol has more off-road oriented components available from the factory, and there are a ton of aftermarket tunes, aftermarket accessories, and things like that available for that vehicle, just like we find in the LX 570. It's also a body-on-frame SUV, and it's also getting a little bit long in the tooth, to be perfectly honest, although the LX has aged better than the Infiniti, I think. The Infiniti's interior definitely feels less premium. It doesn't have real wood trim, the leather isn't quite as nice as what we see in the Lexus, the controls aren't quite as premium. Everything just feels a little bit less expensive. Now, that's not too crazy because it is less expensive. It starts under $70,000 versus starting at $86,830. So there's a really big price delta between these two vehicles. Now's the time for you to sound off in the comment section. What would you get if you were looking to spend between $90,000 and $100,000 on your next luxury SUV? Clearly, budget is not a big deal when we're talking about numbers this large, so personally, I would probably end up getting a Land Rover or a Range Rover. I like the look, I like their off-road capability, I like the gadgets and gizmos in terms of off-roading, and in my mind, if you're spending this much cash on a vehicle, reliability is a little bit less of a concern inside the lease window or average ownership window because you have other things that you could drive when the vehicle has a problem. I would probably consider the Grand Cherokee L, but I don't think that the brand name is quite where it should be as far as competing with the Lexus LX 570. I have to say, I probably would also really strongly consider the BMW X7 because it's excellent driving on-road in terms of its driving dynamics, acceleration, performance, etc., and it's relatively reasonably priced compared to some of the other options in this segment. Let me know what you would pick down there in the comment section. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, Twitter, all those other social places, and of course stay tuned because hopefully we'll have more details on the upcoming replacement for the LX at some point very, very soon. It, in theory, is supposed to get a twin-turbo V6 and perhaps a V6 hybrid system. So it should be relatively interesting. Let me know what you think about that as well down there in the comment section, and I'll see all of you later.